They thought it would be funny to sign up the quietest girl in school for the singing competition. Marlowe Bennett, 6th grade student, Lakeview Ridge Middle School, Lorain, Ohio. She had never volunteered to speak in class, never raised her hand, and had never let anyone look directly into her eyes for more than 3 seconds before lowering her head. So, when Marlowe's name appeared on the talent night registration sheet, written in handwriting that was not hers, pasted in among the names of those who truly wanted to be on stage, the entire hallway burst into laughter that day. To them, it was the most predictable joke of the entire school year. Marlowe Bennett was going to sing? She couldn't even open her mouth loud enough to speak during science class. She answered questions so quietly that the teacher had to ask her to repeat herself a second time. The girl whom most teachers recognized by face, but weren't sure they had ever actually heard speak. And now, that girl was going to sing. In front of the entire school. They were waiting for a collapse, waiting for Marlowe to withdraw her name at the last minute, waiting for an embarrassing moment that would later be retold in the cafeteria as a joke. But when Marlowe stepped onto the stage on talent night, with no musical accompaniment, no group rehearsal, no one standing behind her in support, what happened in that gymnasium that night made the entire audience forget where they were sitting. If you want to know what happened the moment she sang her very first note, to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories we tell each week. Because the real question is, how could a girl who had never dared to speak loudly in class make an entire auditorium fall silent with nothing but her voice? There is a kind of invisibility that no one teaches you how to achieve. You don't learn it from books or lectures. You simply live long enough in certain hallways until it becomes a reflex. Marlowe learned that very early on. Every morning, as she stepped off the bus, she would look toward the school entrance like a soldier surveying the terrain before moving forward. Which hallway had the fewest people? Which staircase was least likely to be blocked? Which corner of the restroom was rarely visited during recess? Which chair in the library was secluded enough to sit through lunch without being seen? Not because Marlowe was afraid, at least not in the way people usually think of when they use that word, or rather, not only because of fear, but because she had learned that the less visible she was, the lower the chance of being hurt. And at 12 years old, that was a very practical lesson, learned from experience, not from anyone's instruction. Her jeans were always slightly loose at the waist, bought the previous summer with the thought that she's still growing. The familiar way of buying clothes in families that don't shop on impulse. Her white sneakers had yellowed at the soles, with a small tear near the right big toe, a tear she would unconsciously hide by placing her left foot over it whenever she sat down. Her jacket was a neutral gray hoodie, worn almost every day. Not because she didn't have other clothes, but because neutral gray was the easiest color to blend into the background. Brielle Knox, one of the girls who usually gathered by the lockers near the cafeteria entrance, had noticed those shoes since the first week of school, and Brielle was not the kind of person who kept what she observed to herself. "Hey, Marlowe, are you wearing shoes or duct tape?" The others laughed. Not a malicious kind of laughter, or at least they didn't think so. Just the laughter of people who had never considered the consequences. The kind of laughter that, years later, when looking back, might feel embarrassing. But at 12 years old, no one looks back. Marlowe didn't reply, didn't look down at her shoes, didn't look up at Brielle's face either. She kept walking at the same pace, as if nothing had just happened. That was the only thing she could do at that moment. Keep walking. But that evening, When she got home and sat at the kitchen table doing homework, she looked down at the shoes she was wearing, looked at them for a long time, then quietly took them off and pushed them beneath the chair, out of sight. In class, she sat in the third row from the back, beside the window overlooking the football field. Marlowe's grades were always good enough, sometimes even better than most of those sitting in front of her. But whenever Mr. Grant Hollis called her name during science, her answers were always as brief as possible, and her voice so soft that the teacher often had to repeat himself, "Could you speak up, Marlowe? The back can't hear you." And every time that happened, she would blush. Not because she didn't know the answer. She did. But because hearing her own voice echo through the classroom made her feel as though she were standing in the middle of an open field with nowhere to hide. As if a spotlight had suddenly been aimed directly at her, before she had time to prepare for anything at all. And it was a feeling no one truly understood, unless they had lived through it themselves. Mrs. Elaine Carver, her homeroom teacher, had once written on her first semester report, "Marlowe is an intelligent and careful student. However, she needs to be more confident in expressing herself." It was the kind of comment teachers often write when they realize something isn't quite right, but don't have the time to find out why. No one asked why. Apartment 14B on Oberlin Avenue looked no different from many of the others in the complex. Stained exterior walls, an elevator that was frequently out of order, and the smell of laundry mixed with food from neighboring units seeping in through the doorframe no matter how many times they tried to seal it. The kitchen faucet dripped, tock, 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 steadily since last year. Diane had called the landlord twice. The first time, he said he would send someone. The second time as well. By the third time, Diane didn't call anymore. She simply placed a small bowl under the faucet to catch the water. Diane Bennett came home at 6 in the morning, after her night shift on the packaging line at Sheffield Foods. Sheffield Foods produced the frozen meal boxes sold in supermarkets, the kind people buy, put in the microwave for 3 minutes, and eat while watching television. Diane's job was to stand at the final inspection station of the line, looking at each box before it went into the labeling machine. Any box that was dented would be pushed aside. Any that was fine would be allowed through. 8 hours, standing continuously, in a factory that was always colder than the outside temperature because the cold chain had to be maintained to keep the food from spoiling. After 3 years of doing that job, her left knee began to ache every afternoon. A dull pain, not acute, but never disappearing. She hadn't gone to see a doctor because she didn't want to use her paid leave for it. Paid leave had to be saved for when Marlowe got sick. By the time Diane arrived home, Marlowe was usually already awake and getting ready for school. A mother and daughter had 15 minutes, often only 10, to see each other before Diane went to sleep, and Marlowe walked out the door. In those 10 minutes, they usually didn't say much. Diane poured her daughter a glass of powdered milk, the kind that came in a tin from Dollar Tree, nutritionally sufficient according to the label, while Marlowe quickly ate a slice of toast with butter. They looked at each other across the small kitchen table, as if sharing something important without needing to say it aloud. Sometimes Diane would place her hand over her daughter's for a second before getting up to go to the bedroom, not saying anything, just resting her hand there for a second. That was their mother-daughter relationship. Few words, but not little love. Every Friday, the only day Diane didn't have to work a shift, was also the only day they could truly sit together for any length of time. Diane would fry eggs, Marlowe would make coffee for her mother, even though she didn't drink coffee herself, and they would sit at the kitchen table with its peeling faux wood surface, talking about unimportant things. A television program Diane had watched during her break. A funny story at school that Marlowe told only her, or sometimes simply sitting in silence, listening to the dripping faucet and the radio from the upstairs neighbor. But whenever Marlowe accidentally mentioned music, anything related to music, Diane would usually pause for a moment. Not long, just a beat, like a conductor raising her hand before the orchestra begins. And then she would smile in a way that was different from the other smiles of the day. Once, when Marlowe asked why her mother often played gospel music while cooking, Diane set the spoon down and said, "Because your father sang gospel, and you have your father's voice. You may not know it, but I do." Then she picked up the spoon and continued stirring the pot as if nothing had happened, as if she had just said the most ordinary thing in the world. Marlowe sat with that sentence for a long time. Her father had passed away when she was 4 years old, a sudden heart attack, without warning, on a very ordinary Tuesday morning. She didn't remember his face, didn't remember his voice, only a photograph on her mother's bedside shelf, him standing in front of an old red car, one hand raised in a wave, a wide smile on his face. But whenever she sang alone in her room, she always wondered, did her voice sound like his? It was a question she didn't know whom to ask. Marlowe sang when no one was home, not because she wanted to hide it, but because singing was the only thing she did that didn't make her feel the need to shrink herself, the only thing she did where no one was grading her, no one was watching, no one was waiting to see if she would make a mistake. She sang in the bathroom while the water was running, the sound of the stream covering her voice, a habit formed at the age of 8, when the neighbors next door would knock on the wall whenever they heard loud noises. She sang in her bedroom with her face buried in the pillow, just enough for herself to hear, her voice nearly absorbed by the fabric. She sang while washing clothes by hand at the sink, because the washing machines downstairs were often full while doing her math homework, and while waiting for instant noodles to cook in a pot of boiling water. Never loudly, never letting anyone hear. But she still sang. She had a notebook, a moss green one bought from Dollar Tree, the kind that cost 10 cents each when purchased in bulk. Inside were words and sentences she had written herself. Not quite a diary. Not entirely song lyrics either. Just things she couldn't say out loud, but could write down when she was alone. Today, Brielle laughed at your shoes again. You didn't say anything. You never say anything, but you know what your voice can do. That was one line in the notebook. It wasn't clear whether she had written it in anger or in calmness, perhaps both. Because for Marlowe, anger and calmness often existed at the same time, in a way that outsiders found difficult to read. Some pages were filled densely, on long evenings after particularly heavy school days. Others had only a single sentence, with the rest left blank. She never read back from the beginning, only turned to the next page and kept writing, as if looking back at what she had written was something she wasn't ready to face. The song Marlowe sang most often wasn't by any famous singer. They were melodies she pieced together from the songs her mother often played, gospel from the small Bluetooth speaker on the kitchen shelf, R&B from her mother's phone playlist, sometimes a few fragments from Fight Song that she had first heard in a YouTube video, and couldn't turn off afterward. She searched for that song a second time, then a third. After that, she saved it to her favorites list. There was something in that song she couldn't explain at first. Not the lyrics, nor the melody in any academic musical sense, but the feeling that the song had been written from a place people usually didn't admit they were in. The place of those who were exhausted, but still refused to give up. And the song fit her voice in a way she couldn't explain, only feel when she sang. Like a shirt tailored to her exact size. Cole Renshaw and Dylan Mercer weren't bad kids in the way cartoon villains are. They were simply 2 8th-grade students who were bored. Bored of math class, bored of group projects, bored of the long November days in Lorain, Ohio, when the sky stayed gray from morning until evening and there was nothing to look forward to. Lorain in winter was not an easy place to find anything exciting. Cole Renshaw was the second son in a family of 3 boys. His older brother was good at school, good at soccer, and was always mentioned at home as the standard. Cole didn't play soccer, wasn't academically outstanding, and had grown used to being the other one in that story. He didn't resent it, or at least he thought he didn't. But sarcasm was the weapon Cole used when he had no other weapon, and he used it quite skillfully. And Dylan Mercer had transferred from Cleveland 2 years earlier and still hadn't really found his place among the old friend groups here. Humor was Dylan's ticket at the lunch table, and Dylan knew that more clearly than an 8th grader usually understood about himself. "Marlowe Bennett," Dylan said one Monday afternoon, looking at the talent night sign-up sheet posted on the bulletin board near the cafeteria entrance. The sheet was printed on yellow paper, with the school logo in the top corner. "Does she ever say anything?" "No," Cole replied without looking up from his phone. "That's why you should sign her up to sing." Dylan laughed. "You serious?" "You know she'd never dare go on stage. Her name showing up there would be funnier than anything we could come up with." They wrote by hand, deliberately slanting the handwriting to make it look different, then slipped the fake entry between 2 real names before posting it on the board without anyone noticing. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. Less than 5 minutes later, someone had taken a photo of the bulletin board. See Marlowe Bennett, vocal performance. And within a single class period, the news had spread across all 4th, 6th, and 7th grade hallways. Phones were passed around in the restroom during recess. Students who had never known Marlowe now knew her name before the day was over. Not because anyone had introduced her, but because she had suddenly become the main character in a joke. One she had never been asked to be part of. She saw the sign-up sheet on Wednesday. Standing in front of the bulletin board, with 3 others behind her, also looking and giggling in the way of those waiting to see a reaction, Marlowe read her name twice, then a 3rd time. Then she stood still for a while longer. Her hands didn't tremble. That was what surprised her. She knew this was a joke. No one needed to explain it. She knew because the handwriting wasn't hers. Slanted script, deliberately forced to look careless. And she knew because, in this school, no one had ever asked her if she wanted to do anything. No one asked if she wanted to join this group, that club, or anything similar. She didn't exist in those conversations. And yet her name had appeared on a yellow sheet of paper with the school's logo printed on it. People often think that moments like this must come with anger, or tears, or at least the urge to disappear immediately. And it was true that a small part of Marlowe was doing exactly that. Angry in a very quiet way, wanting to disappear through a reflex trained over time. But there was another part of her. The part that had been singing alone in the bathroom for 3 years. The part that knew every word of Fight Song by heart. The part that had written the line, "You know what your voice can do," in the moss green notebook. That part was thinking of something else. She thought of that song, of the feeling of singing it in the bathroom, with the water running, no one listening, of the feeling of her voice opening and not pulling back. She tore a small corner from the sign-up sheet, not tearing out her name, just a tiny piece from the bottom corner as if to mark it, then slipped it into the pocket of her hoodie and turned away. The ones standing behind her laughed louder when they saw she didn't tear her name off, didn't run to a teacher, didn't do anything they had expected. They didn't understand what that meant. On Thursday morning, Ms. Kendra Whitaker waited for Marlowe in the hallway before first period. Ms. Whitaker had been the school counselor for 3 years. She had a habit of standing in the hallway every morning with a green thermal coffee mug in hand and observing. Not in the way a security guard monitored things, but in the way of someone who noticed what others often overlooked. She knew which students tended to arrive late on Monday mornings, and why. She knew which ones usually had to eat lunch alone. She knew Marlowe Bennett, not in the way of student records, but in the way of someone who had watched a child walk down the hallway every day, and paid attention to the way she walked. "Marlowe, do you have a minute?" Ms. Whitaker's office was small, just enough room for a desk, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf filled with spines of different colors. On the corner of the desk sat a small cactus, the round, plump kind, that had been there long enough for her to no longer remember who had given it to her. On the wall was a poster with the words, "You belong here." The right corner of the poster had faded. No one replaced it because Miss Whittaker didn't want to. She wanted it to fade over the years because she believed that the message should be seen in its real state, not brand new. Marlowe sat down in the familiar chair, the kind of blue plastic chair every student understood the meaning of when they were invited to sit in it. She placed her backpack on her lap and folded her arms over it. "I saw your name on the sign-up sheet," Ms. Whittaker said, to her voice careful in the way of someone who had learned that sometimes caution was more important than friendliness. "I just wanted to ask, do you really want to participate?" Marlowe looked at the cactus on the desk for a second. "Yes." Ms. Whittaker didn't reply immediately. She often did that, allowing an answer time to breathe before asking more. It was something she hadn't learned in school, but from years of sitting in this small office with children who didn't yet know how to say what they truly felt. "Do you know why your name is on there?" Marlowe looked straight into her eyes. "Yes." "And you still want to participate?" "I do." She looked at the girl a little longer. Not out of doubt. Just trying to understand something she felt she hadn't quite grasped. The distance between the answer and whatever lay behind it. "All right," she finally said. "Friday evening, 6:30. Do you need anything?" "No. Thank you." As Marlowe stood and left, Miss Whittaker watched her go. There was something in the way the girl had answered. Not stubborn, not reckless, nor the loud kind of bravery she often saw in children trying to prove something, that made her not entirely at ease. But she couldn't quite say why. She picked up her phone, about to text Diane Bennett, then put it down again. Let's wait and see. Diane arrived home at 5:30 on Thursday morning, an hour late because the production line had encountered a technical malfunction, and her shift had to stay behind to handle it. The kind of malfunction the shift supervisor called a minor issue, but which actually meant everyone had to stand waiting for 40 minutes in the cold of the factory while the technician worked. Her legs hurt, not in an acute way, but in the way of a body that had stood for too long and was patiently reporting it. Her Sheffield Foods uniform, navy blue with a yellow logo on the left chest, her name printed on a plastic badge attached to the pocket, carried the smell of polymer from the packaging machines, a smell that never completely washed out no matter how many kinds of detergent she had tried. When she opened the door, Marlowe was sitting at the kitchen table with the moss-green notebook open in front of her, headphones over her ears but no music playing, just to create the feeling of being in a space of her own. On the table was a glass of milk nearly finished and 2 pencils, one with the tip broken off from some unknown moment. Diane didn't ask right away. She set her bag down, took off her shoes, the sole worn down at the right heel. She had bought new inserts last month but hadn't replaced them yet, then opened the refrigerator, looking inside without really searching for anything. It was her habit whenever she needed a second to shift from Sheffield Foods mode to being at home. "Why are you still awake?" "I couldn't sleep." Diane turned to look at her daughter. Wait, there was something in Marlowe's eyes she recognized immediately. Not ordinary worry, but the kind of tension of someone holding something tightly inside and not yet deciding whether to let it go. "Is something wrong?" Marlowe looked down at the notebook. Her finger traced along the edge of the page. "I have a performance at school tomorrow." Diane pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. Not going to change first. Not pouring herself a drink first. Sitting down immediately. "What kind of performance?" "Talent night. Someone signed me up." She looked at her daughter. "Someone signed you up or you signed yourself up?" Marlowe didn't answer immediately. Outside the window, Lorraine was still dark and quiet, the sound of a truck passing on the main road in the distance. Diane didn't press. She had enough years of experience as a single mother to know when to stay silent and when to ask. "Someone signed me up," Marlowe finally said. "As a joke. But I'm not withdrawing." Diane sat with that for a moment. In that brief silence, Many thoughts ran through her mind at once. Wanting to ask who had done it, wanting to call the school the next morning, wanting to pull her daughter into an embrace and tell her she didn't have to do anything at all. But Marlowe was looking at her with eyes that were not seeking comfort, but something else. Seeking someone who could understand why she wasn't withdrawing. And she asked, "What are you planning to sing?" "Fight song." Diane nodded slowly, her gaze resting somewhere on the surface of the table. "Rachel Platten. You know that song?" "I have ears," she smiled, the first smile since she had walked into the house that evening. "Do you want to sing it for me?" "Wait until tomorrow." "I have a day shift tomorrow. I'll try to switch, but I don't know if I can." That sentence changed the air in the kitchen slightly. Marlowe looked up. Diane stood, went into the bedroom, and returned with a small plastic bag. She placed it on the table without saying anything, letting Marlowe open it herself. Inside the bag was a shirt, crew neck, light gray with a faint silver sheen when the light hit it, soft and lightweight fabric. Not expensive, no, but beautiful in a simple way, the kind of beauty of something chosen very carefully, even when circumstances didn't allow for much choice. This was the shirt Diane had bought at Walmart on her way home from the factory. Standing in the women's clothing section for 15 minutes with aching legs and a tired mind, looking through each shirt on the rack and trying to imagine which one her daughter would look like she belonged in. Marlowe picked up the shirt, gently, as if it were something that could break. "Mom." "Don't cry," Diane said, her voice calm but not cold. "I don't even know if you can sing well yet." Marlowe laughed, the first laugh of the evening, small but real. "So, you're going to come watch me sing?" Diane stood, placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder for a second, very lightly. "I'll switch my shift." The gymnasium at Lakeview Ridge Middle School was not impressive by any standard. Low ceiling, fluorescent tube lights emitting a constant faint buzz. The smell of bleach mixed with the rubber scent of a floor that hadn't been polished thoroughly. Old basketball banners hung on the walls, printed with the names of teams from previous school years. Plastic chairs arranged in 16 rows, the kind of chairs that made your back ache after 2 hours of sitting. A temporary stage assembled from wooden panels, not carelessly put together, but if you looked closely, you could still see the seams between each piece. A microphone stand placed at the center. An orange electrical cord taped to the floor with yellow tape in a straight line. But that night, the gym was more crowded than usual. This year's talent night had a rumor, not in a flattering sense, and everyone wanted to see the mute girl step onto the stage. Diane Bennett sat in the 6th row from the top. She had managed to switch shifts. A kind co-worker had taken her place on the condition that she would cover theirs the following weekend. She agreed immediately, without calculation. She wore a dark blue-purple blouse, the one she only wore to church or parent-teacher meetings. Her hair was tied low. No jewelry except the silver ring on the ring finger of her right hand, the ring she had worn since Michael passed away. Not her wedding ring. She had put that away long ago. But this silver one, she never did. She held the program sheet in her hands, printed on white paper, Times New Roman font, and the school logo in the top corner, and searched for her daughter's name. Number 7. Marlowe Bennett. Vocal performance. Diane folded the program, looked toward the still empty stage, then opened it again, folded it once more. The woman sitting beside her, a mother she didn't know, asked, "What's your child's name?" "Marlowe," Diane replied. "Which number?" 7. The woman nodded politely and turned back to her phone. Diane kept looking toward the stage. Backstage, Marlowe sat on a cold metal chair, holding a small piece of paper with the number 7 printed on a white background. She wore the light gray shirt her mother had bought. Her hair was down, with no clips. Her white sneakers were still the same old pair, with the small tear near the right big toe. This time, she didn't look down at them. The first act was a drum performance, an eighth-grade boy who played fairly well, the audience applauding more enthusiastically than necessary because drums were easy to clap along with. The second act was a seventh-grader telling jokes, imitating Mr. Hollis. The entire room laughed because everyone knew his voice. The third act was two girls dancing to a trending song. They danced in rhythm, and the audience clapped politely. The fourth act was an eighth-grader playing guitar. Not bad. And the fifth act was a three-person rap group. Good energy despite the lyrics faltering a few times. The sixth act was a magic performance in which the deck of cards accidentally fell to the floor, causing half the audience to chuckle lightly. Then, Piper Caldwell stepped onto the stage in a silver sequin jacket. The seventh grader who had hosted 3 school events this year and knew exactly how to hold a microphone so that it looked right. Next performance, Marlowe Bennett, vocal performance. There was no applause beforehand, only a particular kind of murmur. Not the excited kind, but the kind of murmur from people who knew what was about to happen. In the second row from the top, Cole and Dylan sat side by side, their phones already in hand. Cole had opened his camera since the previous act. See, Marlowe stepped out from behind the curtain. Stepped out the way she walked every day. Not looking down. Not lifting her gaze to search for anyone in the audience. Not running. Not slowing down. Just walking forward at a normal pace. And that normalcy, in the room's atmosphere of anticipation, became strangely pronounced. Standing before the microphone, she didn't grasp the stand, only held the body of the microphone with both hands, gently, in the way of someone who had held it many times in her mind, before holding it in reality. Then she looked out at the audience, not searching for her mother, not for Ms. Whitaker in the corner of the room, not for Cole, Dylan, Brielle, or anyone else, just looking into the space between all of them, as if she were looking at something. Only she could see. There was no musical accompaniment, nothing but the waiting silence of the entire room, and the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Marlowe took a breath, a deep one, enough for those sitting nearby to see her shoulders rise and fall, and then began to sing. The first sound was very soft, almost just breath given shape, so soft that those in the back rows had to strain to hear. "This is my fight song." Someone in the back row let out a small giggle. A student leaned in to whisper something to the one beside them. Cole began recording, but Marlowe didn't stop, didn't look in that direction, didn't change anything. The second line was steadier, not louder, steadier, as if her voice were finding its footing in the air of the room and had found it. The third line began to open. By the fourth line, when her voice reached the words, "Take Back My Life Song," something shifted. Not in her voice, but in the air of the room itself. The shift had no name in any musical dictionary, but anyone present could feel it. The sensation of the atmosphere suddenly thickening in a different way. It wasn't simply that her voice was good, although it truly was. Something no one in the room had expected, including Diane, who already knew her daughter could sing. But singing like this, in front of everyone, without music, without a group, with nothing at all, that was something else. Marlowe's voice wasn't polished, not smooth in the way of someone trained at a conservatory. There were places where it was rough, unrefined. But that very roughness made it almost hard to breathe, because it was real in a way that things overly polished could never be. Real in the sense that people recognized it the moment they heard it, even if they couldn't name it. By the chorus, the laughter had disappeared entirely. Cole's phone lowered, not because anyone asked him to, but because his hand lowered on its own, the body's natural reflex when the mind is pulled somewhere else. In the sixth row, Diane sat up straighter. Her hand tightened around the program, now folded into quarters. She wasn't crying. Not yet. She simply looked at her daughter the way one looks at something they have known for a long time, but had never truly seen with their own eyes until now. like someone turning on a light in a room you've been in for too long in the dark. She thought of Michael, thought of the way he used to sing in the car every Sunday morning on the way to church, unaware of himself, unconcerned with who might be listening. That voice, warm, rough in the way of someone who sang with their chest, not just their throat. Marlowe had her father's voice. She had known that for a long time. But hearing it ring out like this, in a gymnasium heavy with the smell of rubber, was something she had never prepared for. At the hallway entrance leading outside, Mr. Walter Briggs was pushing a cleaning cart past. He stopped. Not out of politeness, but because he couldn't help it. He stood in the doorway, both hands on the handle of the cart, and listened. Not in the way of someone evaluating good or bad, but in the way of someone who had just realized something. Marlowe sang the chorus a second time with everything she had, without needing anything more than her voice. No colored lights, no LED screens, no background music, no choreography, only her voice, the rubber-scented gymnasium, and 200 people sitting in silence. But when she reached the final line, "This is my fight song / prove I'm all right song," her voice didn't tremble, didn't thin out in the way of someone running out of strength. It expanded, as if all those years of singing alone in the bathroom, all the times her voice had been absorbed by a pillow, all the mornings she had walked into school with her head lowered, all of it was being turned into something else, right now. Then silence. Not the silence of no one knowing what to do, but the silence of air needing a second to rearrange itself before what came next. The first applause came from a man sitting in the third row, the father of a 7th-grade student. He didn't know who Marlowe was, didn't know the story behind the name printed on the program. He only knew that he had just heard something out of the ordinary. Then a mother in the next row began clapping. Then a group of 8th-grade students in the standing section. The same group that usually gathered in the hallway outside Marlowe's classroom. Then Mrs. Elaine Carver, the homeroom teacher, standing at the side of the stage, clapping with eyes reddened in a way she would not mention in the teacher's lounge the next day, but that no one would forget. Then everyone. Not everyone stood, because someone prompted them to. Not because it was the polite thing to do, and they stood because remaining seated no longer fit what had just happened in that room. Diane Bennett stood as well, both hands over her mouth. She didn't cry out loud, didn't say anything, just stood there, eyes wide, looking up at the stage. Not far away, Miss Kendra Whitaker stood in the corner of the room with her hands clasped in front of her chest and closed her eyes for a second. She remembered Thursday morning, the way Marlowe had sat in the blue plastic chair and said yes without hesitation. She remembered telling herself, "Let's wait and see." Now, she didn't need to wonder anymore. In the second row, Cole sat with his phone lowered from a moment he didn't remember. The screen was dark. He looked up at the stage, then at Dylan, then away. Dylan said nothing either. There were moments when both of them knew there was no sentence that would fit. And the best one was silence. Brielle Knox, on the other side of the room, stood clapping along with the others. But the expression on her face wasn't the same. Not pure surprise, but something more complicated. Like when someone realizes they were wrong about something and isn't sure what to do with that realization. On stage, Marlowe stood still. She didn't bow her head, didn't smile out of reflex, didn't cover her face. Just stood there with her arms at her sides, the microphone still in her hand, looking at the room now rising to its feet as if trying to confirm whether this was real. Then she found her mother in the audience, 6th row. Diane standing, both hands covering her mouth, looking straight into her daughter's eyes. Marlowe looked back. In those 3 seconds, 3 seconds of them looking directly at each other through the applause of the entire room, something was given. Without words, someone handed Marlowe a bottle of water as she stepped in behind the curtain. She didn't open it. Her hands were still trembling slightly, no longer from fear, but from the kind of shaking that comes after releasing all the tension the body has held for days. The kind of trembling the body creates to restore its balance. A seventh-grade student standing nearby whispered, "You just made the whole school go silent." Marlowe didn't reply. She sat down on the cold metal chair and looked at her shoes. The shoes with the small tear near the right big toe. Still there, unchanged. She thought, how strange. This feeling didn't resemble the sense of victory in movies. Not radiant, not weightless, the way it's often described. Just something heavier and more real. Like when you set down a burden you've carried for so long without even knowing you were carrying it. And only after putting it down do you feel the weight that had been on your shoulders. It wasn't over. Nothing was over. Brielle was still Brielle. Coal was still coal. School was still school. Home was still home. With the dripping faucet and the refrigerator that needed a plastic container lid wedged under one of its legs. But something inside her had changed. Not big, not dramatic the way it is in movies. Just something small, but real. Like a decision that had been made without needing to be spoken aloud. Ms. Tessa Harmon, the music teacher, stepped in behind the curtain with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something no curriculum had ever prepared her for. "Marlowe," she said, her voice not entirely able to maintain its usual calm. "Have you ever studied music? Vocal training, theory, anything?" "No." She looked at the girl longer than necessary. "All right," she finally said. "I'd like to meet with you next week. Is that okay?" Marlowe nodded. Ms. Harmon stood there for another second, as if wanting to say something more, then decided not to, and walked out. While the remaining performances continued, there was a man standing near the exit, who did not sit down. He was around 50 years old, with salt and pepper hair, wearing a dark blue windbreaker without a logo, holding no program and taking no photos. He stood with his arms folded across his chest, not in a defensive way, but in the way of someone concentrating, watching with the expression of someone who had not come for entertainment. His name was Vaughn Ellison. He ran the North Shore Youth Vocal Ensemble, a nonprofit vocal training program for students aged 10 to 16 in the Lake County, Ohio area. His program had no major sponsors, no dedicated building, and no prestigious awards. But over the past 15 years, he had placed 23 students into professional music programs. And he did so by going to places others did not look. He had come tonight because a friend's daughter had her name on the program. Performance number 9, violin. He had prepared himself for an ordinary evening, watch one performance, then go home early. Then Marlowe Bennett walked onto the stage. After the final performances ended and people began to leave, he approached Ms. Whitaker, who was standing near the door collecting the remaining program sheets from the chairs. "The girl in number 7, Marlowe, do you know her family?" Ms. Whitaker turned to look at him. "And you are?" He handed her a business card. "Vaughn Ellison, North Shore Youth Vocal Ensemble." She took the card, looked at it for a second, then looked back at him in the way of someone considering whether to trust. "Were you here from the beginning?" "The 5th performance. Long enough to hear the 7th. "Are you serious?" "I don't say things I'm not serious about, ma'am." Ms. Whitaker held the card and glanced toward the stage that was being cleared. "I'll speak with her mother, and you should know. Her family is not one with many options. If this is a paid program—" "Completely free," he interrupted gently. "Formal training, performance opportunities, regional competition scholarships. We don't charge students, never have." She looked at him once more. "I'll be in touch." He nodded, took a step away, then paused without turning back. "You know, I've been doing this for 15 years. In a year, I might meet 1 or 2 people with a voice that has that kind of depth. Some years, I don't meet anyone at all." He paused for a beat. "That girl sings with something that, at 12, people only have if they've lived through something real. Then he walked out the door, without another word. As Marlowe walked down the hallway on her way out, Mr. Briggs was mopping the floor at the far corner, the stretch of corridor leading from the gym to the main entrance. He was the janitor who had worked at Lakeview Ridge for 13 years. Long enough to have seen 3 generations of students pass through this place. Long enough to know the names of most teachers. Long enough to know which pipes tended to leak in winter and which lights usually failed before anyone called for repairs. He didn't often speak to students. Not because he wasn't friendly, but because he believed his job was to keep the floors clean, and everyone else had their own part to do. And he did both well. He stopped when Marlowe walked past. He didn't call out, just paused the mop and lifted his head. Marlowe saw him stop, so she stopped as well. The two of them stood in the quiet hallway, as the noise from the gym behind them faded. "Girl," he said, just like that, his voice low and even. "You called me, sir. You sing well." Not a loud compliment, not the kind of, "You have real talent," or "You surprised the whole school." Just, "You sing well," in the way of someone stating a fact, without embellishment. "Thank you." He looked at her for a second. Not long, just enough to say what he wanted to say next. Don't let anyone make you believe you have to make yourself smaller to fit into this space. Then he picked up the mop and continued his work. Marlowe stood there for a moment longer, watching his back, watching the way he moved the mop back and forth in steady strokes, as if he didn't care whether she had heard him or not. Then she continued walking toward the exit. The sentence wasn't glamorous, not made to be remembered, but precisely because it wasn't made to be remembered, it became the kind of sentence people remember forever. Diane drove a gray 2009 Honda Civic, the one with the right side mirror cracked at one corner since last winter, when someone had parked too close. Mother and daughter sat in silence for the first few minutes. Lorraine's streetlights at night passed by the window in a familiar rhythm. The laundromat closed, but its sign still lit. The gas station open with someone in the cashier booth looking at their phone. The Baptist church on the corner with a neon letter that had been out for a long time and never repaired. Marlowe looked out the window. Diane focused on driving. "You sang better than I thought," Diane said after a while. Marlowe turned to look at her. "You thought I didn't sing well? I knew you sang well." Diane didn't turn, still looking straight ahead. "But you sang better than what I knew, and those are 2 different things." Marlowe sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the familiar rooftops drifted past. "Do you hear Dad in your voice, Mom?" Diane didn't answer immediately. The light turned red. She stopped the car. Her hand rested on the steering wheel without tightening, but her thumb moved slightly, her habit whenever she was thinking about something difficult to say. "Yes," she said. "I hear him." The light turned green. The car moved forward again. "Does he say anything else?" "No." Silence returned, but not an uncomfortable one, the kind of silence between 2 people who are inside something together and don't need to speak to confirm that it's real. When the car stopped in front of the apartment building, Diane turned off the engine but didn't get out right away. She looked straight ahead for a second. "Your father would be very happy," she said, very softly. No one said anything more. The 2 of them opened the car doors and went inside. On Saturday, Marlowe woke up at 9 in the morning. Nothing had changed in apartment 14B. The kitchen faucet still dripped. Tock, tock, tock. The familiar rhythm that had existed there since Marlowe was small, from before she even knew what the word drip meant. The refrigerator still needed a plastic container lid wedged under its left leg to keep it from tilting. The morning smell in the apartment was still the scent of cheap soap and the strong coffee her mother had left in the machine. Nothing had changed. But when Marlowe sat up and placed her feet on the floor, she realized she was sitting with her back straight, not hunching her shoulders out of habit, not lowering her head to look at her feet before standing up, just sitting there, back straight, looking out the window, as if her body had made that decision while she slept, without asking her. The light gray shirt was carefully hung on the hook behind her bedroom door, the same way she had hung it the night before going to bed. Marlowe looked at it for a moment. Then she took the moss-green notebook from the drawer and flipped to the last blank page. She sat on the bed and wrote a sentence. Not a clever sentence, not a beautiful or carefully chosen one, just a true sentence from someone who had gone through a night and woke up to find that something had changed without knowing what to call it. You've already been here. You just need to stop apologizing for it. She looked at the words, didn't read them again, just looked. Then she put the notebook down and went to the kitchen to make coffee for her mother. On Monday, the school was the same as always. Not the same in any magical sense. There were no crowds welcoming her, no applause when Marlowe walked into the hallway. The rows of lockers were still there. The bulletin board was still there. The talent night sign-up sheet had been taken down and replaced with a poster asking for holiday food donations. But when Marlowe walked past the hallway near the cafeteria, Brielle Knox was still standing in her usual spot with the same group of friends. And when Brielle saw Marlowe walking by, she stopped mid-sentence and watched her, then said, not loudly and not quietly, "You sang well yesterday." Not an enthusiastic compliment, not an apology. Just that sentence, in the voice of someone saying something difficult, but knowing they needed to say it. Marlowe heard it, stopped, her looked toward Brielle. "Thank you," she replied, then kept walking, not stopping to savor it, not waiting for Brielle to say more, not needing to. Cole avoided Marlowe all week, taking different hallways when he could, looking down at his phone when he couldn't. Dylan passed by once during recess, paused for a moment as if about to say something, then didn't, and kept walking. Marlowe didn't expect anything from them and didn't feel disappointed either. It turned out those things weren't as important as she had once thought. What mattered wasn't that those who had been wrong admitted they were wrong, but that she no longer needed them to. On Tuesday, Miss Tessa Harmon met with her after school, handed her a choir registration form and said, "Not required, but I want you to know there's a place for you there." Marlowe filled out the form right there, without reading all the terms. On Wednesday, Miss Whitaker called her into the office and handed her Vaughn Ellison's business card. Marlowe took the card, looked at the name, looked at the phone number. Who is he? He runs a vocal training program for youth in Lake County. Has for 15 years. I've called to check. Ms. Whitaker looked directly into her eyes. And before you ask, completely free. What does he want? He wants you to join. Marlowe looked at the business card. I'll ask my mom. That's all I needed to hear. North Shore Youth Vocal Ensemble didn't have an impressive headquarters. They used the lower level of an old community building in the Oberlin area, the kind built in the 1970s, with red brick walls and small windows set close to the ceiling. 2 practice rooms, a dark brown upright piano that had passed through many hands before arriving here, and music-related images, not store-bought posters, but printouts taped to the walls with double-sided tape. Not luxurious, but not artificial either. On Saturday morning, Diane drove there with Marlowe at 9 o'clock. She parked in front of the building, turned off the engine, and the two of them sat quietly in the car for a moment, looking toward the door. Can you go in by yourself? Yes, Mom. I'll wait here. You don't have to wait. You can go home and come back to pick me up in 3 hours. Diane looked at her daughter. Remembered the night standing in the clothing section at Walmart at 2 in the morning. Remembered the way she had said, I have a day shift tomorrow, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Remembered the photograph of Michael on the bedside shelf. 3 hours, she said. Call me if you need anything. Inside the practice room, there were 6 other children, ages 11 to 15. A boy from Illyria with a tenor voice that surprised her. A girl who had competed in singing competitions since the age of 8, carrying a color-coded binder. The others were at different levels, but all of them had performed on stage somewhere before. Marlowe was the only one in the room who had never taken a music class. Vaughn Ellison did not treat her differently from the others. He didn't give her special attention in the way of, "This is my new star," but he didn't overlook her either. He had everyone stand in a circle, sing in pairs, then asked each person to sing a chosen excerpt. When it was Marlowe's turn, she chose Fight Song. He let her sing all the way through. Didn't stop her midway. Didn't take notes. Just listened, with his arms folded and his gaze directed toward her, though not directly into her eyes. When she finished, he nodded once. "You sing with your body." Most people begin learning to sing with technique, breathing, posture, scale exercises. You don't have technique, but you have something technique can't replace. It can only support it. He looked directly at her. "Now, we're going to add technique." The next 2.5 hours were 2.5 hours of Marlowe doing things you never see in musical films. Standing with proper posture, not upright in a military way, but in a way that allowed her body not to block her voice. Breathing with her diaphragm instead of her chest. Singing a single note and holding it for 15 seconds. Repeating it. Then repeating it again. Not glamorous. Nothing glamorous about it at all. But Marlowe listened very carefully. Not because anyone asked her to, but because it was the first time in her life someone had spoken to her about her voice. As if it were something real. Something worth taking seriously. When Diane came to pick her up at 12 o'clock, Marlowe walked out with a small note in her hand. The exercises Vaughn had told her to practice every day at home. Handwritten in blue ink. Diane looked at the paper. "That's a lot of things." Marlowe slipped the paper into her pocket. "Not really." Diane looked at her daughter. The way she walked out of that building, the way she held the paper in her hand. Something in the girl had shifted, in a way she didn't have the words to describe, only to recognize. "Next time, I'll come in and wait inside." "You don't have to, Mom." "I know, but I want to." There were things Marlowe didn't tell anyone. For example, during the third workshop, after singing the chorus 6 times in a row to adjust her breathing the way Vaughn instructed, inhaling at the right moment, holding the rhythm, releasing at the exact time. She stepped outside and sat down on the steps along the side of the building. The air was cold. Late November in Lorraine was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. She sat there not because she needed fresh air, but because, suddenly, she wasn't sure she wanted to go back inside. Not because it was difficult, although it was in the way of things that demand more than you think you have to give, but because that difficulty made her realize she was beginning something real. And beginning something real meant the possibility of truly failing. Singing in the bathroom carried no risk. No one graded you. No one expected anything. No one was disappointed. But singing on stage did. And singing in a practice room with 6 other people did too. Less glamorous than a stage, but in some way even more real, because those 6 people were actually listening, not just sitting in an audience. She sat on those cold steps for 10 minutes. She didn't cry, didn't think of anything specific. Just sat there, looking at the road ahead, cars passing by, an elderly woman walking her dog on the sidewalk. Then she stood up and went back inside. No one was waiting at the door. No one patted her on the shoulder. No music swelled. She simply stood up, walked in, and continued. It wasn't a grand moment, but it was hers. Not a moment for anyone else to witness and feel something about. And when she returned home that evening, she didn't write anything in the moss-green notebook. She simply placed it on the table and went to sleep earlier than usual. 3 months later. North Shore Youth Vocal Ensemble organized a community performance at Harborview Hall, a public building with 200 seats, sufficiently bright lighting, and a real stage with deep blue velvet curtains. No longer a gymnasium, no longer a temporarily assembled wooden floor. Diane Bennett sat in the third row. Not the front row, because she didn't want to sit in the front. Sitting in the front was to be seen, and tonight she had not come to be seen. Nor the back row, because she wanted to see her daughter's face clearly. Third row. Center. She held nothing in her hands. No program. No phone. Just sitting there with both hands resting on her lap, her dark blue-purple blouse freshly washed and pressed, the silver ring on the ring finger of her right hand. Beside her was an empty seat, so she had left it empty, intentionally, without telling anyone why. The opening performances of the evening were all good. A 4-part harmony group, a duet, a student singing an aria. The audience listened and applauded at the appropriate moments. The atmosphere was warm in the way of a small community evening in a small town. Not grand, but genuine. Vaughn Ellison introduced Marlowe as the closing act. Marlowe stepped out from backstage. She wore the light gray shirt her mother had bought, now carefully washed and pressed, the faint silver sheen of the fabric still catching the light. Her hair was down. Her white sneakers were still the same old pair, still with the small tear near the right big toe. She hadn't bought a new pair and didn't want to rush into it. She looked down toward the third row. Diane was looking up. Her eyes were red, not from sadness, but from a kind of emotion without a precise name. The kind people often mistake for joy or pride, but which is both, and more. Beside Diane was the empty seat. Marlowe looked at that seat for a second, then looked back at her mother. Diane gave a small nod. Marlowe turned back to the microphone. The song she sang tonight was not fight song, and it was one she had written herself. A simple melody, unadorned lyrics, just things she had written in the moss-green notebook over many months, pieced together into something that could be voiced. The lyrics spoke of a bathroom and the sound of running water, of shoes with a tear, of a question with no one to ask, of an evening when she stepped onto a stage because others wanted to see her fall, and she didn't. She sang the song without looking down, without closing her eyes, just looking straight into the space before her. The wide openness of the small hall, where hundreds of audience members sat in silence. When she reached the final line, the one written about the empty seat, and someone absent but still there, her voice did not tremble. It simply opened, for the last time, fully. The kitchen faucet in apartment 14B on Oberlin Avenue still dripped. Tock, tock, tock. Diane still didn't have the money to fix it. Her left knee still ached every afternoon. Sheffield Foods was still cold during every night shift, and her uniform still carried the polymer scent that never quite washed out. Those things had not changed. But every Saturday morning, a gray Honda Civic with a cracked side mirror drove through the familiar streets of Lorraine, and a 12-year-old girl walked into a red brick building in the Oberlin area, holding a moss-green notebook in her hand, with a handwritten list of exercises in blue ink in her pocket. Walking in, not shrinking, not making herself smaller, not apologizing for entering, just walking in. Marlowe Bennett's story did not begin on talent night. It began with the times she sang in the bathroom while the water was running, not letting anyone hear. The years she kept her voice as something too precious to place out in the open. Talent night was simply the first time she decided to let the world hear what she had known for a very long time. The empty seat in the third row. Diane knew whom it was for. Marlowe knew too. And that night, when her voice opened for the final time, both of them felt that the one seated there was listening. If you would like to follow more stories like Marlowe's, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the journeys to come. Sometimes, the smallest things we dare to do are what change everything.